continue on with this wonderful presentation from Jesse Jenkins. This is covering the details of the ERCOT disaster in Texas. So this is incredibly important because it illustrates how close Texas was to not just the loss of power that they suffered, but a cascading blackout, which would have killed thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people possibly, by taking away energy from everyone in the state. As we can see right here, when the frequency dipped below 59.4 hertz, that is a critical threshold. If that condition stayed for an additional 5 minutes, even more generation would have tripped offline. And this would have cascaded across the network. That would be absolutely terrifying because that is the tipping point. As Jesse Jenkins shows, this is how close the ERCOT grid was to a cascading failure that could have easily blacked out the entire system. So going into the night of Valentine's Day, February 14th, a new winter peak demand of 69,222 megawatts was set at 7:06 p.m. By 1:23 a.m. in the middle of the night on February 15th, frigid temperatures had left more than 35,000 megawatts of generating capacity offline. If you're unfamiliar with the units, 35,000 megawatts is 35 gigawatts, and that is power delivered instantaneously at the grid. That is, let's say if they were all nuclear power plants, that would be 35 of them missing. Texas has 4. So you're seeing now the available generation and estimated load without load shed. And so the dotted line, the difference between the cyan line and the dotted line is that there was that demand over the ability to generate load. This was known almost immediately that there were problems coming. Here's a timeline of events. 8:30 a.m., conservation alert and media appeal. At 10 a.m., ERCOT had a emergency meeting focusing on the natural gas supply. At 10:54, there was a watch alert, insufficient ancillary services. That means that the frequency was going out of control. That 60 hertz was dipping below 60 hertz. It was dipping down towards 59 point something. 1 p.m., Stable Operations Center update. 2 p.m., news conference, forecast emergency operations. 3:17 p.m., a new alert watch, projected reserve capacity shortage. That means they could not even predict. Well, they could predict that they would not even have the capacity to meet the next day's demand. 5:19 p.m., watch freezing precipitation forces transmission outages. This one says afternoon, but yeah, so this is some point in that day. NWS issues wind chill warnings. 7:06 p.m., new winter peak demand, 69,222 megawatts. I'll go ahead and post a link to this in chat. Faced with greater demand and diminished generation capacity, ERCOT, the grid operator, ordered transmission utilities to start disconnecting millions of customers. This is known as load shedding. The initial order was to shed 10,500 megawatts of demand. This grew to a height of 20,000 megawatts by the end of February 15th. And we can see here the percentage of various companies. CenterPoint Energy Houston dropping nearly a quarter of their customers. Encore Electric Delivery Company dropping over a third. No, sorry, this is not of their customers, this is of the total. So Houston shouldered 25% of the outage. Small correction there. And Encore shouldered the plurality at over 1/3 of their customers or of their capacity being shed. ERCOT, like all grid operators, must balance supply and demand for electricity at all times within very tight physical tolerance ranges. If demand exceeds supply, generators strain to meet the greater load and frequency of the alternating current power system. To meet the greater load and the frequency of the alternating current power system drops. That's when that 60 hertz starts to go down. If sensors at generators detect a decline in frequency of more than 1%, for more than a few minutes, power plants automatically disconnect to avoid damaging overworked generators. That means that these generators, they are all locked at the same frequency. They are optimized for 60 hertz. If your throttle is predicting the engine running at a certain RPM, and so it's injecting fuel, it's injecting timing for the wrong frequency, that is damaging to that engine. The same thing for most every generating source. As one overworked generator shuts off, it places more strain on the remaining generators, triggering more plants to trip off, and so on, in a cascade of failures that can black out the entire system. A grid operator's primary job is to avoid this outcome. On February 15, ERCOT was thus faced with no other option but to start emergency blackouts to shed demand and restore balance with the vastly diminished supply. This new after-action report shows that the frequency of Texas grid dropped to a low of 59.4 hertz for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. That sounds minor, but as ERCOT explains, more generators would have automatically dropped offline if the frequency had stayed below 49.4 megawatts for over 9 minutes. This illustrates just how delicate the balancing act is that electricity system operators maintain at all times. The Texas blackouts were minutes from being far worse, none of which diminishes how devastating and often deadly the days-long blackouts were for all affected. Here's a postscript. This chart shows how rapid failure of 9,000 megawatts of natural gas plants along with 2,000 megawatts of wind just after midnight appear to have precipitated the initial frequency drop. 15,000 megawatts of gas generators eventually went offline, and 1,300 megawatts of nuclear and 2,000 megawatts of coal.